Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Daniel Rotaro, and I'm a fresh graduate of the Faculty of Letters, Babeș-Bolyai University.
Good for you.
Thank God. For our current Transylvania lecture, we have invited two renowned Shakespearean scholars, Dr. Adrian Papahagi and Dr. Ashley Gray, to explore the enduring relevance of Romeo and Juliet. Through their distinct perspectives, our guest speakers will offer a nuanced understanding of why Shakespeare remains pivotal in both literary and cultural discourse, while providing insights into how this famous play continues to resonate with modern audiences. Dr. Patrick Shaw Gray is Professor of Literature and Dean of the Center for Arts and Letters at the University of Austin. Previously, he served as Director of Liberal Arts at Durham University and as a Senior Visiting Fellow at MCC. He studied at the Université Paris-Sorbonne, the University of Oxford, and Yale University. He is the author of Shakespeare and the Fall of the Roman Republic, Selfhood, Stoicism, and Civil War, editor of Shakespeare and the Ethics of War, and co-editor of Shakespeare and Renaissance Ethics. Dr. Adrian Papahagi is Professor of English Literature at Babeș-Bolyai University and Director of the Center for the History of the Book and Text, CODEX. He holds a PhD in Medical Studies from the Université Paris-Sorbonne. He has taught at the Sorbonne and the Catholic Institute of Paris. He has done doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships at Oxford and London, was a fellow at the École Normale Supérieure and New Europe College. Before starting, let me confess that I had the honor of working with both of them. With Professor Dr. Gray, we have studied a few years back the play Macbeth here at the MCC, while last year I had the honor of working with Professor Papahagi in writing my BA paper at the Faculty of Letters. Without a doubt, they are two excellent people whose knowledge and openness is unparalleled. Finishing on that note, gentlemen, the stage is yours.
All right. So I thought I might get the ball rolling with a question for you. Actually, I'll present a problem that sometimes happens for me when I try to teach Romeo and Juliet, or even I try to understand it. And I'd be curious to hear what you think. So usually when I teach Shakespeare, I talk about the nature of tragedy. And I say that often in classical Greek or Roman tragedy, the tragedy is completely outside the protagonist's control. You know, like the classic example would be Oedipus the king. He and his parents do absolutely everything they can to avoid the horrible prophecy from coming true, but it still comes true. And the horror of that tragedy is the realization that we as human beings are, not in control of our own fate. Whereas with many of Shakespeare's mature tragedies, like Macbeth or Othello, I tend to see the protagonist as in some way responsible for his fate. There's a sense in which Othello or Hamlet or Macbeth, they themselves bring about the suffering that they undergo through their own poor decisions. And I find Romeo and Juliet a complicated, apparent exception to this pattern, where it's not so clear who exactly is to blame, so to speak, for what goes wrong in Romeo and Juliet. Is it the lovers? Is it their family? The prologue talks about them being star-crossed. What's the nature of the tragedy in the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet?
Yes, thank you very much for starting with my favorite question about fate and providence, to which I dedicated my PhD and some of the subsequent books. And it's one of the central questions. Is there such a thing as fate? Is anything fated? Are there things, of course there are things that are out of our control, right? But can't we do anything? I mean, it's raining. We can't control that. Or it's pouring. There is, I don't know, a flood and our house is destroyed. Are we not guilty for building it where we did? Or our acts wholly under the control of an exterior superior and sometimes either hostile or indifferent force? Well, Romeo and Juliet, and Shakespeare in all his plays actually maintains this ambiguity. We learn from the prologue, as you say, that a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. From forth the fatal wombs of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. The prologue in form of a sonnet is telling us. So you see, from forth the fatal wombs, the parents who give them birth, the two families, Montague and Capulet, being enemies, in a way doom their children to inherit something of that curse, which is beyond their control and predates even their birth, right? So they are star-crossed. Romeo says, "Oh, I am fortune's fool," at one point, right? But so does Hamlet, who say, "The world is out of joint, oh, cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right." So does Macbeth. He says, "If chance will crown me king, why chance may do so without my stir." They all seem to think that there is something which, at least, I don't know, the events as they are when they come there, and as they have been for a while, are outside their control, and they must play their role. But then you come to think that Romeo and Juliet are also guilty for their predicament, for their death. They're over hasty to begin with. And that's perhaps their hubris, that's their fault. The play is very much about old and young, right? And perhaps we'll come to that, the old generation and the young generation. In the second prologue, for example, he says that the new passion is now old affection on his deathbed lies and something like that, right? Old and new, the old generation, the new. At the beginning, the Capulet is telling Tybalt, for example, who wants to stab Romeo right away when he identifies him at the ball, at the party. He says, "Don't do it, over hasty boy." Friar Lawrence is chiding both Romeo and Juliet for their haste. Had they taken it more slowly, like us older people who are not as hot and eager.
I think we're supposed to say distinguished gentlemen.
Distinguished gentleman, of course, was my my second choice, but I went for the plain old, blunt,
Sorry, go ahead.
disingenuous adjective. So, yeah, they all tell them to take it slowly, right? But then they hurry. If only Romeo had waited a bit in the vault, Juliet would have come back to life, right? And they would have been happily married there in the crypt, right? In a very Gothic environment. Nonetheless, I mean, some may find it even appealing from different points of view, even erotic, but it's not the case there. But no, they hurry, and that's their hubris. The hubris of Hamlet, or perhaps the hamartia, the lack of judgment, the mistake is that he acts when he shouldn't and he doesn't when he should. He doesn't stab Claudius when he could and should. But then he stabs Polonius behind the curtain the next scene when he could have waited to see who was stirring behind the curtain. And then the whole tragedy unfolds, because before that Hamlet was not a murderer, right? He was just the dear son of a father murdered, but not a murderer himself. So Shakespeare keeps this ambiguous. And the problem of prophecies, you know that from Greek tragedy, is that if something is prophesied, and Macbeth is perhaps the best example, the witches, the weird sisters, greet him with the words, "Hail thee, Macbeth, that shall be king hereafter." Yeah, but when? It doesn't say when. It doesn't say how. I mean, that doesn't force him to become a usurper. Yeah. Maybe had he waited, he would have become king anyway. I mean, God knows, right? But he didn't wait. So what is fate and what is in our control? And Shakespeare doesn't, I think Flaubert said that stupid people always want to draw conclusions. That's their fault. Vouloir conclure. Now, in great literature, that's also the case. You must leave it open. This is why we are still discussing about it. If we had a moralizing, cautionary tale telling us, kids, it's not good to hurry when you fall in love, don't kiss on the first date, don't marry the next day the boy you just met at a party the evening before, then perhaps it would be junk literature, not Shakespeare, but he doesn't tell us. He leaves that totally open. And I suppose we'll never know if there is such a thing as fate, or we bring fate upon ourselves by our actions, or if the way we negotiate with the conditions which are outside our control is not ultimately somehow in our control. That's what I would say. So I leave it ambiguous the way Shakespeare does.
Fair enough. I was going to say, I feel like our profession is to draw conclusions. So where that leaves us, I'm not sure. Well, I'll start with a sense of Shakespeare as perhaps different from our own presuppositions about responsibility. So one of the questions that we were talking about in class is, does Shakespeare expect different things from different people, different positions in society? There's a sense in which I think Shakespeare tends to be, one might say, negatively classist, in the sense of like the prince is responsible for the lords and the lords are responsible for the lower orders. And also Shakespeare tends to have maybe a hierarchical view of the relations between men and women, or between the father of the household and the child. So we were talking about the scene where Romeo is completely freaking out because he's been banished. Yeah, and he's talking with Friar Lawrence. He's killed Tybalt, so he's been banished from Verona, and he is hysterical. He's crying, he's weeping and blubbering on the floor. And Friar Lawrence is accusing him, saying, you know, I thought you were more of a man. Do you think you're a beast? Like, what is wrong with you? Stand up, pull yourself together. And the question becomes, where does Romeo fit in this hierarchy? You were talking about young and old. And I think part of the point that Friar Lawrence is making there is that Romeo is at the transition from the childlike state, where you're not responsible for your own emotional control, to the, now that he's married, to the state of a husband or a man within the relationship who does have responsibility not only for himself, but also for Juliet and for, you know, kind of the way that he responds to his own emotions. It raises the question of where we distribute blame, such as could be said. And I think often in Shakespeare we see, in particular, these kind of innocent young women. I'm thinking of people like Ophelia or Cordelia, who do suffer, and their suffering is not typically of their own creation. So Shakespeare seems to see it as, you know, the husband or the father has a particular responsibility for those under his care, and if he does something wrong, not only himself but also those that he cares for will suffer. And then this is repeated at a larger level with the nobility or the king over the society, which is not very forward-thinking to say, but how I sometimes think about the structure in the play, the social structure, I mean.
Yes. But of course the buzzword here, which is very trendy, so trendy indeed that it has become trite and obsolete and ridiculous, is patriarchy, right? Everything is patriarchy. Now, the two of us, I think, have a common misgiving about this word patriarchy. If you look at the plays, indeed, males seem to patronize and to, in a way, to determine women's fate, to come back to this. Polonius certainly uses Ophelia as his tool for spying on Hamlet. Old Capulet wants to get Juliet married in a few days' time to Paris, whom she doesn't even know, right? So apparently But then Juliet doesn't do so. She says no, she pretends. I mean, none of them is really overruled. Of course, Ophelia, a lot more. But generally, Shakespeare's women are surprisingly intelligent. Now, as I reread this play for the 100th time, I bought this one in Paris on the 20th of November 1997. I arrived there in October 1997. So you see, one of the first things I did when arriving in Paris is I bought myself an Arden edition of Shakespeare. And then I've been writing here all the dates when I read it completely. You should see, it's tens. Now, I reread it this morning and noticed something that I didn't pay attention to. Do you realize that Romeo is committing suicide by poison, which is supposed to be feminine and relatively cowardly? You see, women used poison, Catherine de Médicis in France and so on. And Juliet stabs herself, which is manly. And now that you drew my attention to it, and that actually I noticed it myself while rereading it, Friar Lawrence asks him exactly the question that Lady Macbeth asks Macbeth. Art thou a man? Art thou a man? Exactly the same phrasing.
Yeah.
So, indeed, Hamlet is relatively unmanly.
Yeah.
He's crying and blabbering and joking. Even his first love is not serious. When he first appears on the stage, he's soliloquizing like a stupid schoolchild, rehearsing his oxymora, you know, that he learned for Petrarch. Oh, living death, burning eyes, and so on, right? So he is, you can't take him seriously. His love for Rosaline, whom she forgets the moment he sees Juliet, makes him look, well, I don't know if unstable or boyish, or I don't know, but boy and man are two words that are very frequent in Shakespeare. Shakespeare's characters, especially heroes, use boy as an insult. For example, Antony in Antony and Cleopatra calls Octavius Caesar the boy Caesar. Tullus Ophidius in Coriolanus, to humiliate him at the end, after Coriolanus has betrayed everybody and is defeated, he calls him boy of tears, boy of tears. And very often boy is used in this play, I noticed this also, to humiliate. For example, Hamlet calls Tybalt boy, or Tybalt calls Mercutio boy. And then Friar Lawrence calls Hamlet boy. The question is also one of growing up.
Yeah.
It is a play about adolescence. Is Hamlet a boy or a man? If he's a man, he must do what a man does. Well, he overdoes everything. He's too eager in love, but also too eager in hate. And this play is also very much about love and hate, of course. My only love sprung from my only hate, right? Love and hate are some of the words that come over all again. He's excessive in both. He should be more temperate, as everybody enjoins him, as Friar Lawrence asks him to, right? So in terms of thought, he has his own guilt. Although Shakespeare is careful not to make him look like a murderer the way that he does with Hamlet. He doesn't want, he wants you to have compassion with the main character. So, for example, he warns Tybalt not to attack, and then Tybalt stabs Mercutio through his arm, actually through Hamlet's arm. So he's not directly guilty, and then Tybalt runs away and comes back. And it's only then that he challenges Romeo again, and Romeo has to stab him, right? With Paris, in the final scene in the crypt, he tells him to go away. And he tells Paris, Juliet's fiancé, to be, wanted by the parents. He tells her, he warns him that he hates himself more than he hates Paris, because he wants to commit suicide, not to kill Paris. But Paris wouldn't go away, so he ends up stabbed. So you see, here too Shakespeare leaves it ambiguous, I think. Although you could find fault with Romeo, at the end of the day he tries to behave. He's also cornered and pushed to the wall, as they say in the first scene of the play, right? He really has no choice. So once again, this ambiguity, is it his choice or a fault in his character? Is it fate or ananke, which we call in Romanian ananghie, by the way. We have this word in Romanian. Yeah, a ajuns la ananghie. He ended up, we took it from Greek. But it is the ananke of Greek tragedy, you see. It's a dead end. He has no choice but to stab, right? And here too, Shakespeare leaves it like, as for Juliet, she is smarter than, but perhaps we'll come to that. So far about patriarchy in Shakespeare. Shakespeare's women, I feel, are always smarter than the men, or at least more innocent.
Yes.
Or more earnest. Ophelia is more earnest in her madness than Hamlet in his faint one. Desdemona is really faultless. I mean, she is perhaps the most innocent sacrificial victim of them all. Juliet is incredibly smart. Just think of the answer she gives her mother when she asks her if she wants to marry Paris. She says, I look to like if looking, liking move, but no more deep will I dart mine eye. It's full of sexual innuendos. She's very sly. When she answers her mother another time, you should see how she phrases the sentences. I don't remember them by heart now. But she refers to Hamlet, but seems to refer to Paris. So she's incredibly smart, perhaps smarter than Romeo. I keep saying Hamlet instead of Romeo and the other way around. But I've always done that because I think that Romeo is young Hamlet in a way, and there are a lot of similarities.
I think that makes sense. It's interesting to think about those two plays in juxtaposition because you're right, they are both studies in the hastiness and misjudgment that we associate with adolescence, where acting too suddenly, not acting when you should, having trouble deciding when is the right moment and when is not. I'm struck by what you said as well about how Shakespeare's heroines are often more perceptive and more earnest. A part of me thinks that for Shakespeare, the ultimate tragedy seems to be not only to suffer oneself, but to have caused the suffering of someone who is more innocent than yourself, someone whom you can imagine, like for a parent, like to have your child suffer, or for a husband to have your wife suffer is in some ways more tragic than to suffer oneself, I think the question then is, what could prevent that suffering? And I'm very struck by what you said about how Juliet has the courage to stab herself, whereas Romeo poisons himself. And I thought, this reminded me of the association of both of these means of suicide with philosophy. Because you remember Friar Lawrence tells Romeo, what you need, Romeo, is philosophy, right? He says, you're in adversity, you need philosophy, by which Shakespeare, when he uses the word philosophy, seems to mean
wisdom.
Wisdom, yeah, and a particular kind of stoic wisdom, a capacity to sort of dissociate yourself from your own emotions and say, well, I'm feeling this emotion, but I'm going to control how I respond to it, and this emotion is in some way suspect. And I think that the deaths of Romeo and Juliet suggest a limitation to the value of philosophy. That the Stoic philosophers kill themselves with the sword, like Cato. Socrates famously kills himself with poison. I think there's also another possibility that is invoked in the play, which is the possibility of Christianity. But we always see it harnessed, well, we don't always see it, but we typically see it harnessed to secular love. So there's a sense in which Romeo is very devout, but he's devout to Juliet. He talks about her as a shrine, he talks about, his idolatry of her and so on. So a part of me thinks that Shakespeare may be building in a critique of courtly love, of this practice of taking the reverence and devotion that is best directed towards the divine and instead focusing it too entirely on a worldly object. What do you think?
Yes. I don't view Romeo and Juliet as a particularly Christian play. As Shakespeare, in his later plays, I think that increasingly grace becomes one of the dominant topics. And I'm paying more and more attention to grace, not only in Measure for Measure, but also especially in The Tempest and in other plays. I can't see grace here. In Hamlet, the ending of Hamlet is perfectly providential. You know, when Hamlet says, if it is to come, it will be, and so on, the birds, the sparrows that can't fall, quoting the Gospel of Matthew and so on, the readiness is all right, accepting the will of God and accepting also that his fate was not to be God's elect, but to be God's, as he says, scourge and minister, right? So he's the scourge and minister, that is to say the whip, the instrument of God's wrath, or perhaps the instrument of, I don't know, a demonic embassy from hell, the embassy of death brought by the ghost. Now in Romeo and Juliet, indeed, Romeo is, you could come with this Christian critique, yes, he puts Juliet in the place of God. I mean, come on, at 14, 15, all of us put women in the place of God. I, for my part, rarely thought of God when I was 14 or 15, and I can tell you I thought about most of my colleagues of the other sex, of course. So I can't tell you that I find this unnatural. And yes, Shakespeare is toying with the courtly love convention or tradition, as C.S. Lewis put it, right? The play, that's what I wrote in this little book, which some of my students know or will know. I'm saying that Shakespeare is playing actually here with the sonnet. He's freshly out of sonnet writing, and he's actually sonetizing, dramatizing a sonnet in a way. The play starts with a sonnet. Everybody knows the first time Romeo and Juliet meet, they exchange the lines of a sonnet. They become a couple in the final couplet of a sonnet, as I keep saying in course. The second prologue is a sonnet. The last 6 lines are the last quatrain and a couplet from a sonnet, and so on. So Juliet speaks 13 lines before committing suicide. She's 14, the number of lines in a sonnet, and so on and so forth. So this is a very, how should I say, manneristic and bookish play as well. And today, while rereading it, I noted how many times book and reading are mentioned in this play. Not only You Kiss by the Book, which everybody knows, but Paris is presented by Capulet as a book that only lacks the covers or something like that. So books, books, books. It is a very bookish, a livresque play. Now, Romeo is using oxymora. He is the typical sonnet lover, right? The lady is a goddess treading in the sky. You know, Juliet also dramatically appears from a balcony, right? She's placed above him. She's often compared to the sun, which is uncommon because normally Shakespeare compares men to the sun. Hamlet keeps punning on the sun. I'm too much in the sun, and so on, right? She's compared to the sun, to stars, and so on. She's stellified, as in Petrarch. And in the subsequent tradition of the 1590s in England, where almost everybody was writing sonnets as a pastime. So she is the Donna Angelicata, the stellified woman. She is compared to a jewel. The story is medieval, and this is why I always think that it's much better to be a medievalist when you look at Shakespeare than some sort of modernist who keeps saying Shakespeare our contemporary, that stupid mantra, and that which doesn't explain anything. I mean, Shakespeare is great because he's like us, and look how smart we are. So being smart, he's a bit like us, so he's great. It's the contrary. It's because he's so medieval that he still works like a great master. Now, you see, Juliet is, Romeo goes to the Capulet's party to find Rosalind, right? And the party is, the Capulet's house has high walls. This is the typical hortus conclusus from the Roman de la Rose and from medieval literature. Rosalind is the rose, the mystical rose of love, the idealized woman of the sonneteers, who is to be found in that perfect hortus conclusus, the garden of love. protected by high walls. And she's also protected, of course, her sexuality is protected from the male intruder from the outside. We can further analyze. So he wants to find a rose in a garden. This is Chaucer and Jean de Meun and so on. So it's Roman de la Rose, 100%. What does he find? He finds there a jewel in the night. Juliet, whose name is sometimes abbreviated Jewel, is a jewel. And Romeo often compares her to a jewel shining, or a star or something, a jewel in an Ethiop's ear, right? Night and day, dark and bright, are also, of course, essential things in all of Shakespeare, here above all. So he finds a jewel in the sky. That's also the stellified woman. That is, so he is in the mystical realm and in the vocabulary, in the conventions of the courtly love tradition. That's where he's working, in a medieval tradition. Shakespeare is much more medieval than modern, for God's sake. For the simple reason that he lived 200 years after Chaucer and 400 before us. So, all right. He's also more modern than Chaucer in other terms, but that's obvious. So I think we are in this convention. Sonnets, women, the lover is always abject. There is the religion of love. You know, C.S. Lewis, I think he had several points. The woman is inaccessible. Now that Rosalind, she wouldn't be hit with Cupid's arrow. She had more wit than Juliet. She is also a Capulet, that Rosalind, who never appears in the play. Who is Rosalind? Why did Shakespeare need Rosalind? To show us that Romeo is fickle, that he's easily in love and out of love, you know, like an unstable boy of 14. Something like Le nozze Figaro, you know, questo, quella, or that's Verdi, non so più cosa son, cosa faccio. He falls in love with everybody. He's a young boy, for God's sake. So is Shakespeare trying to make his love for Juliet more relative, or just to show how absolute it is? Because it ends in death. It actually, after Romeo falls in love with Juliet, all obscenity, and this is also one of Shakespeare's most obscene plays, by the way. You need a good edition to catch all sexual innuendos, but it's full of them, including the final one when Juliet commits suicide and she says that she will be the sheath of the happy dagger, Romeo's dagger. So you see, in a way, that's the consummation devoutly to be wished. They die together for good, right? And even that is medieval, as I show you in class. Those of you who were there remember, those of you who weren't will, those of you who never come to my classes learn it now. In medieval literature, this idea of love and death, amor morior, love being the lack of death, amors, according to a popular etymology that you can find in Isidore of Seville and in so many other sources up to the close of the Middle Ages. Love and death. Love is undeath, undying. Of course, out of love comes what? Life, new life. But here, this love brings death, right? So in a way, the consummation that they wished is the one, is actually diverted into death. It is confiscated. It is, and that's also something that is extremely medieval. Extremely. So yeah, Shakespeare is actually doing something that we would call post-medieval, because now everything is post, right? So he's doing something post-medieval, but in his mind he's not modern. He's toying with the sonnet tradition and with the medieval courtly love tradition, while realizing that he can no longer work within it. He must come up with something new. And what he does is he destroys that tradition from within while keeping it, I think.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's interesting to hear you mention C.S. Lewis and his allegory of love and his observations. One of the things that C.S. Lewis comments on is how in classical literature, romantic love is often portrayed as a kind of curse. You know, there's relatively few depictions of sort of happy married love, other than the Odyssey in a way, in Greek and Roman literature. Instead, what you get a lot of is this sense of tortured passion for someone that you should not be involved with, like Phèdre, for example, you know. And I think if you think about ancient Greek and Roman society, you have men marrying much younger women, you know, you have arranged marriages and so on. Whereas in this play, we seem to get the impression that love could be a socially healthy phenomenon. That if things were right, then the love between Romeo and Juliet would be a way to reconcile the two houses. This is Friar Lawrence's great hope, you know.
Yes.
And I see in that a very different perspective on the possibilities of romantic love arising, I suspect, from the Christian idea that, you know, in Christ we are neither Jew nor Greek, you know, neither slave nor free, that somehow romantic love across social classes, like what we get in Downton Abbey, for example, where it's like the Brit and the American, or the, you know, the lady of the house and the chauffeur, or so on, that somehow this propensity of romantic love to bring together social categories that are opposed or distinct is good for society, because it forces us to reckon with the essential similarity or humanity of human beings, and that it is somehow an indictment of the society of Verona that they are not set up in a way to allow this to flourish. And I think we see that at the end when Capulet and Montague reconcile with each other and they each build a statue of the other's child. And when the prince says, you know, this was partly my mistake for winking at your discords, you know, for neglecting the fact that you two were opposed to each other. But I wanted to come back around to something else that you were mentioning, which is this idea of grace, and how Shakespeare in his later plays becomes more, I suppose one could say, overtly religious, more overtly engaged with Christianity. I've often noticed in the late plays that Shakespeare seems to be rewriting tragedies. You know, there's a sense in which A Winter's Tale is like a rewrite of Othello, except, you know, the wife who he thought he killed, in fact, turns out to be alive. Pericles is like a sort of rewriting of King Lear, where the daughter that seemed to be dead turns out to be alive, right? There's even for those of you here, a somewhat more obscure play called The Two Noble Kinsmen, where a young woman, the jailer's daughter, goes mad like Ophelia out of frustrated love, but in the end is kind of reconciled and brought around and healed and regains her sanity and ends up with a young man who's more sort of appropriate for her. So I'm curious what you think about the idea that A Midsummer Night's Dream is like an early version of this kind of rewrite or cross-engagement, where Shakespeare's returning to the same concerns, but from a comic angle, or from finding a way to allow a happy resolution.
Yes. Thank you for asking this. In my series on Shakespeare's play, on Shakespeare's complete works, I grouped Othello with The Winter's Tale.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah. So I have exactly the same reading. Now, in the last plays, which are also sometimes called romances, namely Pericles, in this order, Pericles, symbol in The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, Shakespeare is in a way reconciling society. All that was torn apart in the tragedies, all that was buried in a lack of knowledge, lack of awareness in the comedies, because the comedies end in, how should I say, in the characters seem obnubilated. They don't understand what happened to them, especially in A Midsummer Night's Dream, right? But actually in most comedies, they just go back to their lives as if nothing had happened, and they were only this far from tragedy in The Forest of Athens, right? In the last place, Shakespeare reconciles society. Not only this, the classes, as you said. The king and the shepherds become brothers in The Winter's Tale.
That's
in
right.
Sicily. Men and women, old and young, everybody, right? There are no more distinctions. They all become one. Ut unum sint, right, as you read in the Vulgate. they all become one. There is a sense of atonement. Northrop Frye mentioned the reversal of tragic energy in these last plays. What is also interesting is that Shakespeare no longer focuses so much on the young couple, because in the mythological theme, of course, a young couple redeems humanity, starts it afresh, right? Gives it a restart. The old generation, yes, they fight each other and they are envious, like the Capulets and the Montagues. But look, the new generation can fall in love and regenerate society. Out of enmity springs love miraculously. There is human freedom. The two are not actually predestined to hate each other, as evidence that they actually fall in love with each other, right? So you have all this in the last plays. But that's, I think, Shakespeare understanding of his own craft, and you do feel that he's revisiting all his plots, all his types, tragedies and comedies alike. Now, in Romeo and Juliet and the Midsummer Night's Dream, which were written actually in probably the same year or in a very short period in 1595-96, I think that Shakespeare is rewriting Romeo and Juliet in an ironic and comic way in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Why? Because in A Midsummer Night's Dream, first of all, you have, as a mise en abîme in the background, you have the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, which is exactly the story of Romeo and Juliet. Two young people from families, enemy families, they live next to each other, they drill a hole in the wall through which they fall in love, they decide to elope, they end up in a forest, the girl arrives earlier, you know, women seem to be more punctual than Shakespeare, which for once doesn't seem to adhere to reality. Although in my family it's true.
Mine too.
Yeah, so maybe it is true. It's just my sexism speaking at this late hour. It went unchecked. All right, good. So basically, she comes there, a lioness scares her, she runs away, and the lioness stains her veil in blood. Then Pyramus comes, thinks she's dead, commits suicide, and she comes, commits suicide. It's Romeo and Juliet, right? He's mocking it.
Yeah.
And the four lovers in the forest, they start dueling, you know, like Tybalt and Mercutio and Romeo. They could have killed each other, these two fools, Lysander and Demetrius. The girls are incredibly cruel, but what Shakespeare does there is he caricatures it. It's not one couple, you know, the archetypal couple, the superb, sublime couple. No, it's two, to show that it's ridiculous and it can be replicated ad infinitum. Also, at the end of the day, they don't understand the play within the play, Pyramus and Thisbe, and laugh at it. So, yes, I think Shakespeare is mocking that. Then, in Romeo and Juliet, often, I noticed today, I didn't pay attention to it in previous readings, both Romeo and Juliet often say, oh, it's night, I must be dreaming. It can't be true. It's so beautiful, it can't be true. Right? I must be dreaming. Yeah. So it's exactly what is happening in Midsummer Night's Dream. What is this weak and idle theme, no more yielding but a dream? Is it reality or is it a dream? Is our fancy, is everything our fancy's images? Is Romeo really that beautiful and lovable? I mean, the nurse comes and says, come on, Paris is 100 times preferable to... Prospero says, tells Miranda that about Ferdinand, her lover, that to most people this is a Caliban and there are angels to him, right? So you don't know if objectively Romeo or Ferdinand or any of the other young lovers in Shakespeare's plays are desirable, admirable. Hamlet, Romeo looks relatively not very serious at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
So, but then romantic love is redeemed, and here you are right. And that's what makes Shakespeare so great. He is mocking and redeeming it at the same time. If he were only mocking it, he would be in the low register of satire or comedy, which is low, however. Even if we love it and enjoy it, it is low. it doesn't elate, it doesn't enliven, it doesn't lift our spirits. Tragedy shocks, yes. It is the higher of the two, and Aristotle was right here again. But the love that Romeo and Juliet have is at the same time juvenile, ridiculous, how should I say, reckless, perhaps even replicable. And this is what A Midsummer Night's Dream is saying. Had they survived, had they been able to elope, God knows, maybe Romeo would have seen another Juliet or Rosalind or something and say, all right, who will not give a raven for a dove, right? Just like Lysander in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Who will not change a raven for a dove? So, and that's what Midsummer Night's Dream is. A Midsummer Night's Dream is very cruelly showing. Questo, quella, this one or that one, you know. Well, this time, whoever is next. That's, I think, what Jan Kot was saying. They fall in love with whoever is next. Now, this time it was Juliet. Imagine Romeo would have met his Rosalind at the party. What would have happened? Of course, this is not the way to interpret literature, but I'm just saying, right? But on the other hand, once they have fallen in love, that love leaves all obscenity behind. When Hamlet meets Benvolio and Mercutio, they only talk boy talk, you know, which is sexual puns, roughly speaking. But after his encounter with Juliet, he is no longer touched by this. He is in a different register. He looked comical at the beginning with all his oxymoron, but now, no, he means it. And then one last thing to come back to what you said before. Yeah. Romantic love rehabilitated. Well, in the end, even through their deaths, they do reconcile the families. And they do lie together in the twin monument, right? Friar Lawrence said, all right, perhaps their marriage can, but no, their marriage was not strong enough to reconcile the families. It took death. But that makes it eternal. In their final embrace, they can no longer be separated. In actual love, well, in actual life, you see, so Shakespeare is at the same time criticizing and upholding romantic love, I think. And once again, I keep saying this is his trademark, ambiguity, openness. It's both ways. It's not this or the other. It's this and the other in Shakespeare.
That's very interesting to hear you talk about the way in which romance is redeemed in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and to point out as well the way in which that word dream appears in Romeo and Juliet and then is taken up again in this play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And a couple things come to mind. One is casting and performance are very important. So I actually think Paris should be cast as the most good-looking, eligible bachelor possible. It actually is more powerful if Paris comes in and he looks like Adonis and Romeo is kind of scrawny, and then you see, her love for Romeo is more to it. It's a bit like in productions of Antony and Cleopatra. There are some hints in the text that Antony and Cleopatra should not necessarily be dazzling, godlike figures, that, you know, Antony should be a bit older.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you get is this tension between the way that the lovers see each other and the way that they seem to the audience. Mm-hmm. And that tension, I think, is a lot like what we feel when we see the rude mechanicals put on this comic play. And I think a really great performance of, say, Antony and Cleopatra, the audience is constantly torn between seeing Antony and Cleopatra as completely misguided, two debauched old people who have gone to seed and are ruining their lives, and then being caught up in the way those two people see each other, their sort of folie à deux, where they each see each other as like a god and a goddess. And in the same way, I think a good version of Pyramus and Thisbe, it should be simultaneously ridiculous and moving. And we get this in the commentary. You know, in Shakespeare's version of Pyramus and Thisbe, the rude mechanicals, like a carpenter and a tinker and so on, are putting on the play. And it's terribly done. You know, the verse is bad, the acting is worse, and yet somehow it should be moving. And we see that in the nobles, where one of the noblemen says, you know, this play plus someone dying would be enough to make me sad. And the other nobleman replies, you know, beshrew my heart, but I do pity the man. He says, I'm actually moved by this. And then they go into some commentary where they say, actually, every play is in some way imperfect. Like every theater show, we make up for the imperfections of the show with our imagination. There's something that we bring to bear that brings it to life. And I think Shakespeare sees an analogy there to romantic love. That somehow romantic love is an exercise of the imagination, like the theater, where we take something that in itself may be flawed or even pitiable and give it a grandeur that is in some way godlike. And I think the question that he raises in A Midsummer Night's Dream, having done all this to sort of rehabilitate romantic love and to rehabilitate theater, is to ask about, is this in some way to be self-deceived? You know, and to explain what I mean by that. In these late plays that we're talking about, like Pericles or A Winter's Tale, you get the sense that the marvelous coincidences and movements that reconcile the people and that reveal that the person who seemed to be dead is in fact alive, they seem fairly transparently the acts of the gods. You know, you have Zeus appear, or Jupiter appears, and he talks to them. Whereas in A Midsummer Night's Dream, that kind of action is presented as magic or fairies or in a lighter, more secular way, which I think is not meant to represent God's providential action, but instead to represent the workings of imagination or fantasy or fancy. And, you know, one of the lovers at the end is still under the spell of the magic potion.
Exactly.
And it's a little bit like Molière. Like, you know, Molière's comedies, like the Bourgeois Gentilhomme, the comedy depends on the character being deceived. And when you leave the comedy, you think, well, what happens if this character ever wakes up and realizes the reality of the situation? So what do you think about that kind of question that Shakespeare builds in?
Yes. Well, I think there are two sides to it. The first one I would like to highlight. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, as readers of literature, something that is often forgotten nowadays, we deal in words, not in ideas and ideologies and, you know, class, capitalism, patriarchy, blah, 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 blah. We deal in words, and one of the key words in Romeo and Juliet is I, but also in A Midsummer Night's Dream. At the beginning of the play, when you know, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, Hermia is obliged to marry a boy that he doesn't love, Demetrius, but she's in love with another one, Lysander, all right? And her father, Aegeus, comes to the Duke of Athens, Theseus, and says, I want her to marry Demetrius or she must die. And she says, oh, cursed to see love by another's eyes. I wish my father looked but with mine eyes, she says. But in the end, her eyes in the forest prove no good, and the boy's eyes are no good, because the boys fall in love with Hermia, who is short and dark, pardon me, whereas the other one is tall and blonde, and apparently for Shakespeare that's
in his mind,
how it goes. So why should he prefer that one? I mean, why are both boys in love with the girl who is less desirable according to the canons of the sonnets and the courtly love and the medieval tradition, you see? Now, in Romeo and Juliet, the eye is also at the center. Seeing with the eye and hearing with the ear. Eye and ear, I would say. Because apparently, the eye is sight, right? Whoever loved who loved not at first sight. They see each other and they love. But hearing gives you reason. Sermons, lectures. The friar says, I wish you used your ears more. I can't remember the lines now, but he says, I wish you used your ears more than your eyes, right? So, how much can you trust your eye? We have all been in love at young ages, And then later on we had some sort of disenchantment and said, what made me fall in love with that person? Who was not objectively what we expected. You see, when you are in love, in a way, you are charmed. And when you're out of love, you become more realistic. When was it the real thing? When you were charmed or out of charm? When you were under the spell or when you were disillusioned? When you saw it by light or by night? All right? Now, imagination is essential. Because many things are real because we imagine them. And things that we don't imagine perhaps don't even exist for us, do they? At the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is of course very much about imagination and poetry and the poetic imagination, the reasonable, rational even character of the play, Theseus, who is the Duke of Athens, he stands for law and order and the sun and male. He speaks by day. He doesn't go by night in forests, he only appears by day, in daylight. He is the Apollinic, he is light. He discards the story of the night. He says, the lunatic, the lover, and that's perhaps the most famous words from the play, the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold. That is the madman. The lover, all is frantic, sees Helen's beauty in the brow of Egypt. The poet's mind in a fine frenzy, rolling, and so on, imagines things. Right? So, come on, that's fancy. It's nonsense. We only care for hard fact, figures, statistics, age, right, the law, reason. And then comes Hippolyta, his wife, and says, yes, but all the story of the night told over and all their minds transfigured so together, more witnesses than fancies images, and grows to something
more substantial than a dream.
More grows to something of great substancy, and howsoever strange and admirable, and grows to something of great substancy, but howsoever strange and admirable. So she says, no, let's allow some room for imagination. All their minds transfigured so together, and all the story of the night told over, grows to something of great constancy. Right? It witnesses more than fancies images. Because what we imagine is as true. When we imagine it, it is. I mean, our mind creates. This is our godlike power. You see, when God says stone, a stone materializes instantly. When he says mountains, all the mountains materialize in a second. We don't have that power. When we say something, it doesn't just happen. It doesn't arise. It doesn't become actual. But in some way it does, because it still exists in a realm of imagination. Ideas have consequences. Ideologies have changed the fate of nations. Shakespeare is still there with us, although what we are talking is just words, which is ultimately imagination, breath. These people didn't exist, perhaps. I mean, certainly not Caliban and Ariel and Puck, Romeo and Juliet, allegedly so, but not the others, you see. So, and yet they are there. They do speak about something which is actual. Hate, love, death, love, light, night, passion, sight, eye, ear, old, young, all of these are true, right? And in imagining them, actually, we are using our godlike powers of creating worlds, although they do not materialize in stone and wood and so on, right? That's what Shakespeare says. So, is all that we see or seem just a dream within a dream? That's from Poe, not from Shakespeare, but it could be by Shakespeare. Is it a dream? I mean, are we a dream here? What will remain of this in 10 years' time? You won't even remember it, and yet something of it will stay with you, just as the plays stay with us, right? So Shakespeare's imagination becomes something real for us, and we talk about it as if it were there. So yeah, fancies, images are still powerful, I would say.
This is a very natural evocation for me of my favorite passage in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and possibly in all of Shakespeare, which is Bottom's dream. So just for those of you who may not be familiar with A Midsummer Night's Dream, Bottom the Weaver is one of the actors called the Rude Mechanicals, and he is their star actor or over-actor. He's very over-eager. He's a kind of ham actor, we would say. And I would say back when I used to do acting, he was by far the most fun part to play. And I was wondering why that is, and I thought, we've talked a lot about romantic love between, man and woman. There are other kinds of love, like love of yourself and love of God. And Bottom has very strong love of self. In his mind, he's wonderful. Everyone loves him. He's the greatest actor that was ever born. And, if you are an actor playing that part, that is a very fun space to be in for like months at a time. I played Macbeth. I was miserable for 3 months, but I played Bottom. I'm like, life is great. Everybody loves me. Anyhow.
Well, that's a huge leap from Bottom to Macbeth.
It is.
And the other way around.
It's true. So in the play, Bottom goes underneath an enchantment where his head is transformed into the head of a donkey. And the queen of the fairies, Titania, goes under an enchantment where a magic potion leads her to fall in love with him. So he has this idyllic experience where he wanders out. All his friends run away because they see him with the donkey's ears. And the queen of the fairies shows up and is madly in love with him and has her court of fairies, pampering him every which way. And then he falls asleep and it all sort of dissipates. And he wakes up and he has to grapple with, well, what just happened to me? And he has a beautiful little speech, which actually quotes, but also slightly mangles Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where he says, eye hath not heard, ear hath not seen. He's trying to say nothing could capture how wonderful this experience was. So he is inadequately capturing St. Paul's language by which St. Paul is trying to describe what waits for us in the afterlife. So there's a sense in which Bottom is trying to recall what for him was like a religious revelation of how wonderful life could be. And he says, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call this Bottom's dream, and I'm going to incorporate it into the play. Yeah. So what do you think about this speech?
Yeah, it's magnificent. He says, I'll have Peter Quince write play about it. It will be called Bottom's Dream because it has no bottom. And mind you, in Romanian, you could translate bottom by a name which means ass. I mean, the American way.
I see.
Arse. You see.
Yeah.
So you can say something with fondo. You see, fond. It's often mistranslated. So I have an argument with translators who keep translating him as something else, and it's stupid. Yes, the dream is bottomless. You see what's great in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and here Shakespeare's irony once again. So let's the facts first. So the four lovers who end up in the forest, you see there are a misplaced love at the beginning, then their eyes are charmed with love in idleness, which shows that in a way you can't trust the eye either, and then Puck, who anoints them, makes a mistake, whether willingly or unwittingly, God knows, because he mocks humans. He says, God, what fools these mortals be, right? So Puck is mocking the humans. They come out of the forest. As you mentioned, one of them still remains anointed, so he is in love only under the spell, so the spell endures after the night in the forest. But when they wake up and they see they watch the play within the play, which is in a way about what happened to them in the forest. It also happens in the forest at night, and it ends up tragically as their love could have ended up. They mock it, and they just mock the poor acting, instead of realizing that it's about them. Whereas Bottom, who is the bottom of the world, he's really the stupidest character in the play, is smart enough to realize that the eye of man has not heard, the tongue of man has not seen, and so on. He mixes up all the senses, but that's because he's also mixed up, he's also confused. He says, what happened here? Methought I was, and then he says, yet I know not what methought I was.
Yeah.
He doesn't say what he thinks he was. Titania says it. Titania says, "Methought I was enamored of an ass." Yeah. Whereas he said, what happened here? Was it or wasn't it? But he doesn't say what. He leaves it open. So in a way, Shakespeare says what? Look, the most sensible character of them all is Bottom at the end of the word, at the end of the line, because he realizes that he can't understand what happened there. It was a mystery. So for him, the encounter, I wouldn't say with the sacred, but with a mystical experience, with a metamorphosis at any rate, right? Because he had been turned into an ass, a donkey. The metamorphosis cannot be expressed rationally. The senses are confused. And in a way, this is the mystery, also of faith, but here, let's keep it the literary mystery. Some things are best left unexpressed. They can only be suggested, not depicted or expressed or rationalized or understood in logical terms. And this is what Romeo and Juliet end up doing at the end of it. And they realize that what they lived was something close to a sacred, right? And just because it was so brief, so intense, so guilty and at the same time so pure, so selfless and at the same time so consumingly selfish, right? Because it was so intense, it has the purity of some sort of mystical experience, right? As perhaps first love always is, right? For most of us, for all of us, right? So Shakespeare is telling us this. Now, in The Forest, it's the opposite. There, the lovers are fools, that's obvious. And they don't die. They are spared. They come out none the wiser. And they are mocked by Puck, and they mock themselves by not understanding. But Bottom, of all characters, is the one who understands that it's a mystery. And the same thing Shakespeare does in The Tempest, where Caliban, of all characters, is the one touched by grace.
That hears the music.
He hears the music, the divine music, the music of the spheres, the harmony divine. He's also the most musical character of the play, by the way. And he says, "Oh, what a fool was I to worship this dull fool and take this drunkard for a god," and so on. Right? "I'll be wise hereafter and seek for grace," he says at the end of it. "I'll seek for grace." He's the only one. All the others, the King of Naples, Prospero's and the king's brothers, Ferdinand and Miranda, don't understand anything of what happened on the island. They don't understand that they were close to murder, to all sorts of crimes, right? Caliban, of all people, is touched by grace. And what does Shakespeare say here? And this is why I find The Tempest one of his most religious plays, is that grace is really gratis. It's free. It blows wherever it wants. You don't know who will be touched by grace, surprised by grace, and saved. And in a way, Shakespeare, I think in The Tempest, when Prospero leaves Caliban on the island alone and everybody goes back to civilization, in a way he leaves him as heir of his creation, because the island is the stage, it's his fantasy. He is entirely fantasy. He's not taken from sources, he's not taken from real life, he's not a historical character. He is his purest imagination. And he, the body, fully body on the island, inherits. Why? Because he has been touched by grace. Grace finally touches what? Art. And that's the conjunction that Shakespeare leaves us in The Tempest. But we have gone far away from Romeo and Juliet with The Tempest now.
That's all right. That's all right. I appreciate you reminding me that for Bottom, one of the reasons why his dream is so magnificent is because there's no bottom in it. And it strikes me that he's the most self-absorbed character, but what makes that vision magnificent for him is that it's beyond him. Mm-hmm. That's the beauty of it, is that it takes him outside of himself. And it takes him also outside of his verbal capacity. He's very verbally confident. He always has something he wants to quote or to say, and that's the
and
one.
Always mistakes it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Always misses it.
This was glorious enough for him that you're right. He says, "I'm not going to say what it was because it exceeds my capacity." And I think there Shakespeare is commenting on something that love and theater have in common, which is the capacity to take us outside ourselves. You know, if you're with the beloved, or if you are in a theater, you can be transported to forget yourself and to be caught up in something entirely other, and you can be enabled to experience a kind of mystery. And I think for Shakespeare, that is the parallel between the operation of the imagination in romantic love and the operation of the imagination in theater. And then things start to get more complicated when he starts to think about the implications for faith in these later plays like The Tempest.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, yes. So theatre, here I too must feel that he is ambiguous, but I don't want to overstate it, and I don't want to say that I never want to come to any conclusion, because actually I do. I think that he says two things at the same time, and there Puck's epilogue is essential.
Yeah.
He says, "If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding but a dream, gentles do not reprehend. If you pardon, we would mend. Else the Puck a liar call, so good night unto you all." What is he telling the audience? He's telling to us. So imagine you're in a theater, right? The theater is dark like the night. The theater is dark like the night. And what you see on the stage is something which is not really there. It's just shadows, visions, fictions, imagination. When you go out, they will no longer exist. I mean, the actors will take their clothes off and go to their children or to a pub or do whatever actors do after they finish acting. And we don't want to imagine that. All right? Generally get drunk, I suppose, for many of them. But we'll see tomorrow. So it's fiction, and you accept this as fiction when you enter the stage. And then Puck is coming to you and saying, listen, if this fiction has offended you because it showed you how stupid you are, Lord, what fools these mortals be. If you have recognized a bit your own stupidity in the stupidity of the characters on the stage, right? When you were in love, Johnny, Mary, and then you ended up disenchanted, or haste, or passion, or any sort of flaw. And if that offended you, think that these are but fictions, and all is mended. Think that you just fell asleep while this happened and dreamed of it. So you see, he's putting us into a dream. Now, we are the dreamers who dreamt about the dreamers dreaming. Yeah. Is that all a dream within a dream, as Poe asked, right? So think that you were the dreamers dreaming of that. But that's also ironic, because we are mocking the dreamers. So good night unto you all. He says, if you don't understand that this is about you, although it's only fiction, good night. Go back to your night of ignorance, ultimately, right? Of not understanding. But if you have understood that this is ultimately life, although it's just a fiction, dreams, shadows, actors, then perhaps I shouldn't say good night. Perhaps it's dawning on you that this is actually about you. So there is an ambiguous movement there as well. Art, yes, it's fiction, but then it's also reality. It's about human nature. So it's about us. Consequently, we must take it seriously. And at the same time, we don't have to take it too seriously, because it's only shadows. This is what Shakespeare is saying. At the end, in The Tempest, Prospero, who many scholars, including myself, read as, of course, some sort of personification of Shakespeare, or we read it autobiographically. Prospero leaves the island there and goes back to civilization, just as we go out of the theater and go back to our lives. Doing what? Well, the courtiers going back will continue to usurp each other, to lie, to stab, to backstab. The girls will continue to fall in love with the wrong persons. The boys will continue to cheat, and so on, right? They'll keep doing the same things, which means what? That art can't really make you any better. And that's a very terrible thing to realize as an artist. Hitler was listening to classical music and it didn't make him any better. He was a very educated person. He liked art, painting, music. Very many murderers are educated, right? It doesn't make them any better. So art doesn't improve character or human nature. So what's the fact? What is the only thing that can touch us? Grace. And it doesn't come from us. It doesn't come from art. It comes from beyond all of this. It comes from God. And it's something that we don't even deserve. It can touch the most undeserving character, or maybe the one who changed his mind, like Caliban, and became better, right? So, and that's what Shakespeare's final plays say. It's all about grace. Art cannot redeem. Magic cannot redeem. Law cannot redeem. Love cannot redeem. Grace alone can redeem and save. And I think that's the conclusion, but I still need to mature my thought, but that's my drift.
Because it's an attractive conclusion. I'm inclined to agree. Can I ask, do we have time to take questions? Or yes? Okay. Would anyone like to, I know we have a lot of students here in the audience. Would anyone like to ask any questions?
Or comments or on any other topics.
Me. Professor Gray, I noticed that thank you. So I noticed that you pointed out sort of that Shakespeare actually criticizes Stoicism in this play. And actually, this, I would say, does not really happen, but other playwrights in the age who basically rewrote Romeo and Juliet did criticize it and took it sort of further, because I agree with Professor Papahagi that it's actually not so much a Christian play as it is a manneristic play, basically. So I began studying other playwrights too, and I think that Shakespeare does not want to be satirical in this play so much as combative in another way, in a higher frame of mind, I would say.
I think you are right about many of your insights. Shakespeare does have some plays where Stoicism is a preoccupation. I mean, Julius Caesar comes to mind. Many of his Roman plays, he's asking about the ways in which this very intense self-control can perhaps be self-destructive. I agree with you that that's not the main point of Romeo and Juliet. To my mind, the question Shakespeare is asking himself in Romeo and Juliet is something more like, how should individuals and societies deal with the phenomenon of intense, passionate, romantic love? How can individuals try to make sense of this experience? And how can their families and their civilizations, if you like, find a way for it to occur without anyone getting hurt? And it's a different question than what is there in the Roman plays. The link, I think, is where Friar Lawrence starts talking about philosophy. This comes up in various places. We get it in Much Ado About Nothing as well, where, Shakespeare seems to sort of laugh at the idea that Neoplatonic or Stoic philosophy could somehow be adequate to managing this kind of passionate romantic love. And so that makes the play more complicated. I suppose what I would say is Romeo and Juliet is Shakespeare asking himself, assuming that neither Stoicism nor Neoplatonism is adequate to the task of managing romantic love, what can be done? What should families do? What should individuals do in order for this experience not to be tragic, but instead to somehow bring the community together.
I see. Thank you.
So, if art can't make humans better, then what is the purpose of art?
So I'm more optimistic about the possibility of art making people better. I think this is a question that Shakespeare is asking himself. Shakespeare was writing his plays at a time where the Puritans, the religious radicals of his day, were very skeptical about the moral value of theater. They thought, theater was like one step up from bear baiting and prostitution. They wanted the theaters to be shut down. I think throughout his plays, Shakespeare is asking himself and his audience if theater could potentially be repurposed as a force for moral good. We see this in Hamlet, right, where Hamlet tries to use a theatrical production to judge the guilt of Claudius. We see variations on this in, for example, Measure for Measure, where the Duke is setting up various scenarios like a playwright to try to convince Angelo to repent. And I think the conclusion that Shakespeare comes to, insofar as he comes to a conclusion at all, is that it can be valuable for people to see a defamiliarized version of themselves, kind of like when the prophet Nathan explains to King David the wrong that he has done with Bathsheba by using a parallel or an analog. If someone did such and such, what would you think of that person? You would think they were in the wrong. Well, that person is actually you. That is part of the power of theater, is to take us outside ourselves so that when we come back to ourselves, we recognize things about ourselves that otherwise might be too painful to address more directly. I think the limit on that capacity is the human will. I think Shakespeare is very aware of the reality that human beings can refuse to see things about themselves. So for example, when Richard II is confronted with his crimes, he rips up the crimes. He smashes a mirror on the ground. He's saying, I don't want to see myself, right? And he rips up the list of his crimes, or he refuses to look at it. Falstaff as well, when he's confronted with his misdeeds, comes up with outrageous lies to avoid acknowledging them. So this is the tension. Art can lead us to recognize deep truths about ourselves, but we have to be willing to see them. I mean, that you could think of it as the basic cost of therapy. That it's like, if you want to improve yourself, first you have to admit to yourself that there is something about yourself that could be improved, and that not everyone is willing to do. So that's the paradox of human nature that Shakespeare is willing, and not only willing, but very eager to try to tease out how we can potentially see our faults and choose to repent, but we can also refuse to see our faults and persist in exactly the wrong course of action. And actually, I think that is much of the suspense of a Shakespearean drama, especially if you don't know the outcome. If you watch a Shakespearean play, you don't know how it's going to end. It's like watching someone on a tightrope, or watching someone drive a car towards a cliff. You think, are they going to realize what they're doing wrong? Will Othello start to recognize that his jealousy is misplaced? And Shakespeare very nimbly captures the capacity of human beings to change and the capacity of human beings to refuse to change. And one road leads to tragedy, and the other road leads to comedy. But this precariousness of the human soul, this possibility of repentance that may or may not be fulfilled, is what gives his plays, I think, their special electricity and suspense.
Mm-hmm. And if I may add, you're right, and perhaps I didn't put it rightly. When Puck says, if you understand it, you will be improved. If not, too bad. Yes, I think that, of course, drama, like therapy, like faith, like any sort of civilization, can improve you. And we didn't touch upon the topic of nature and civilization. Can nature be improved by civilization? Art is a form of civilization. But I think that here Shakespeare is skeptical about human nature. I mean, not about individuals. And that's a very Christian perspective. As Christians, I speak for myself, I don't want to assume, but as a Christian, I believe that individuals, yes, they can change. Grace, effort, whatever. But not human nature in itself. And that's what Shakespeare is skeptical about. Art cannot improve human nature. I mean, men will forever, human society will forever, let me phrase it like this. Human society will forever contain a great number of rascals, of murderers, of tyrants, of idiots, of lovers, of stupid people, of conceited... Sorry?
Professors.
Of professors, cranks, and other, or as our friend Scruton calls them, frauds, fools, and firebrands, right?
Professors.
Meaning professors, yes. We should also be skeptical about professors. I don't want to say all I think about university because I want to keep my job. All right, so, and about my colleagues, that would be indelicate. But let's keep it there. So no, human nature. When Gonzalo thinks that utopia is possible, reality proves it's not. When Miranda, the naive greenhorn, she's even younger than, no, she's 15, she's older than Juliet. Shakespeare's girls are often 13, 14, 15, as you notice, 16 sometimes, not older. When she says the famous line, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it," Prospero says, "'Tis new to thee." There is nothing new in the brave new world. There is no such thing as a brave new world. There is no paradise on earth. Human nature cannot be changed. We will be forever sinners. And that's one of the, you see, as Scruton called it, the uses of pessimism. Conservatism is pessimist concerning human nature, and from this point of view, Shakespeare was a conservative because he didn't think that men are good by nature, but civilization spoils them. He thinks that men are bad by nature, and perhaps some of them can be improved. Some may be touched by grace. Some may end up being slaughtered and punished for their sins, and some may just foolishly, through fate, through external agency, like the four lovers in the forest, somehow get out of the conundrum and end up happily, but without any merit either in that case, right? That's what he thinks. So it is a skepticism, a conservative skepticism in human nature. That's what I wanted to say. And drama hasn't changed human nature. It hasn't. Maybe a few of us have become nicer, or I don't know, effeminate maybe. Instead of being the killers that we are born to be, we start thinking too much. So overthinking, we become a bit too sensitive and we hesitate. Yeah, well, maybe that makes us human or redeems us, but Shakespeare seems to say that human nature cannot be significantly changed.
So I'd like to tie that back to something you were saying earlier about how in Shakespeare's late plays we do get, as you were saying, a kind of vision of utopia where we have the kings and the shepherds together and the people who seem to be dead turn out to be alive. My own reading on that is that, which is very compatible with yours, is that Shakespeare is in a way telescoping the afterlife or the second coming or the sort of promised end of things in the Christian narrative into the present life. So, you know, during Shakespeare's lifetime, there are prohibitions against discussing Christianity too openly on stage. But I think these mini plays where someone who was thought to be dead turns out to be alive is a way of sort of reminding the audience of the promise of a life after this. And likewise, these sort of happy endings in the late plays where, as you said, the different social classes are reconciled. I think this is Shakespeare saying, there will come a time when these things are healed. That time is beyond the city of man, is beyond secular history, and hence those plays have a kind of fairy tale quality to them.
Fairy tale indeed, yeah.
Yeah, it's because I got into a disagreement with some Marxist critics.
Yeah.
As you might guess.
Yeah, well, being in agreement with them would have worried me.
I see. I see. Well,
all right. So good.
But I think the Marxist critics are right to see these hints of utopia in Shakespeare's plays, of a world without social class, of a world of peace and innocence. I think where they are mistaken is thinking that this means Shakespeare is a proto-Marxist. I think a better way to understand that is that the visions of utopia that we get in Marx are a secularized version of Christianity. So both Marx and Shakespeare are responding to the Christian promise of a better life to come. And Marx is saying that can literally happen in this world, whereas I think Shakespeare is saying, I will symbolically represent that end of things in this world on stage as a reminder that it will come, but only in a different life, only in a different mode of existence than what we have now.
And that's further evidence, if evidence was needed, that Shakespeare was smarter than the Marxists. And Marx, of course, yes, Shakespeare totally smashes utopia in The Tempest, where Gonzalo is actually rephrasing Montaigne's essay De Cannibale. He says, if I were king on this island, what would I make of it? I would forbid all social classes. He actually writes a proto-manifesto of the Communist Party, a proto-communist manifesto, which had been written actually by Campanella in the Città del Sole, by Thomas More in his Utopia. Many people imagined a classless society. And then the two rascals comment on it and say, yet he would be king on it.
Yeah.
And this is where Shakespeare is once again a genius. You may have realized that already. That it's the evil who are right. And that's also something that is in a way grace, a mystery. Claudius as a king is effective. He keeps the Norwegians at bay.
Yeah.
Hamlet, what does he manage? To destroy his family and to get his country invaded, to lose Denmark to Norway, right? And he's right, he's a nice fellow, he's the good guy in the play. Gonzalo is the only nice guy in The Tempest. He saved Prosper a long time ago and helped him survive, right? He gave him his books and also food and so on. And now he's a fool. And who makes a fool of him? The two traitors, the usurpers, the killers, the murderers, the villains of the play, Sebastian and Antonio. That's quite something, right? What is Shakespeare saying? There is no paradise on earth. There is no utopia. Why? Because human nature doesn't change. And the communists, of course, is just hypocrisy. They want everybody to be equal, but you read Orwell's 1984, but some are more equal than the others. That's the end of the line, and that has been what communism has always done wherever it ended up. At the end of the day, most people were dejected and deprived of everything, and the few were the new aristocracy. Come on. Churchill had a very wise saying about this. I know only two parties. I'm here and I'm not moving, and get out so that I may sit down in your place. He phrased it better than I did here. All right? So only two parties. And that's true about human nature. There are only two parties. The young and greedy and hungry, and the old confiscating people, powerful. That's it. There are it's not angels and no, it's two. And that's it.
So, two things. One is, I do think that one of Shakespeare's main questions for himself, a puzzle that he worries over throughout all his plays, is this question of whether it may be possible to reconcile a Machiavellian understanding of human nature, a realist, a villain's sensitivity to the dark side of human nature, with a heroic Christian compassion and sense of the value of human life. Like, can you be both? Can you be a good Machiavel? Mm-hmm. You know, can you be, in Christian terms, someone with the heart of the dove and the mind of the serpent. Can those two things coexist in the same person? And we could probably go on about that for a lot longer. One of the occupational hazards of being a professor is that we're happy to talk for ages. I know it is getting late, so I think we will go ahead and wind down.
You can shoot us when you think we've overshot.
Yeah. But we're very grateful to you all for coming out and joining us. We hope that this was helpful. We would encourage you to go see the production of Romeo and Juliet at the Hungarian Theater here in town, coming up this Friday and a few other nights. It's supposed to be a very original and interesting production. I have not seen it. Professor Papahagi has not either, but we encourage you to go and take a look and think what you think and let us know. And we hope to see you again soon.
For my part, I guess and fear.
I'm very curious. I'm very curious to see what's going on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Excellent.